wasting money on cures. Forgot how to fix myself. They say that time is free. Then why is it so precious? Oh, I'll save memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. Time is running out. Time is running out. Lately I've lost my track. I've sailed the deeper seas, hoping to find something to bring back better times. Oh, I'll save memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. But time is running out. 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 Time is running. Time is running out. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over. They can't be over now. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over now. Time is running out. Time is running out. Time is running out.
Okay, hi there. As the music fades away, welcome to our final Paper 3 live stream for Edexcel students. If you're with AQA, well, thanks for coming. But that's tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. We're going to walk through Paper 3 for AQA tomorrow in a special live stream. This session, 20-25 minutes, is purely focused on Edexcel Paper 3, which for most of you is your last paper, or maybe you have politics or maybe business later on in the week. Mia says, I've been binge watching the Paper 3 shorts. So we put together 18, I think, little 90-second macro shorts, which I think are super useful. There's a load of stuff out there, isn't there, on the Insta web, on TopTick and things like that, with 18-year-olds saying that they know the difference, the killer line for an A star, or people occasionally sniffing mangoes or other such fruits, and giving you great exam advice. The key is to be really serious about Paper 3. This is the last paper. The first two papers really determine whether you pass or fail, essentially. Paper 3 determines your grade. So this next 20 minutes or so will be super useful, just to zoom in on and really focus on what's needed in Paper 3 and how best to get those grades. So a quick look at the paper itself. I think it's in the morning, so don't be late. The time allowed is 2 hours. If you have normal time, 2 hours. And there's 100 marks for this particular paper. Now, crucially, the marks are 100 and they stay at 100. So papers 1 and paper 2, they were out of 100, but they then weighted them up to 117.5, so that those two papers together are worth 70% of your grade. Paper 3 is worth 30% in total, but keep in mind that is 100 marks. That is a lot of grades. Okay. Now, in the 2-hour paper, you have 2 data responses, or 2 contexts, as they're sometimes called. Each of them has a 5, an 8 and a 12. So they take out the 10 and the 15 mark questions, which you had in papers 1 and 2. But there's no section A, of course. No, there's no multiple choice. There's no diagram and calculation questions. So somebody's saying this paper scares me. There's too much writing. Actually, Mita, I mark papers, as you know, and students write more in this exam, but there's fewer questions. So they've taken out the 10 and the 5. So you have a 5, an 8, a 12, and a 25. And then you go again, 5, 8, 12, 25. So in fact, there's 2 less questions in the data response than you had before. So paradoxically, it means you can write a little less and get more marks. Now, as Anna says, it's question 1 micro, question 2 macro. And a great question. Typically, although not always, the first question tends to be on themes 1 and 3, and the second context tends to be on themes 2 and 4. However, this is a reply to Anna's question. They do slip in the occasional macro question in as one of the 5, the 8, and the 12, and they can pay it on question 1, and they can slip in a micro question on question 2, context 2. As we'll have a look, we're going to look at 2 past papers in a second. Now, you then have 2 25 mark questions. Now, they're essays, but they're data response essays, if that makes sense. You get a choice of each, one from 2. So your paper 3 on Thursday, 50 marks out of 100 are for your essays. So this is clearly going to be absolutely crucial to how we do in the final analysis. Okay. Manage your time carefully. We recommend an hour on each section with at least 30 minutes allocated to the essay. We tend to find that students do better on paper 3 by 2 or 3 percentage points, particularly the B, the C and the D grade candidates. They tend to do a little bit better. See, that's what the data suggests. Partly because they've already done 2 papers, so they've got a bit more exam savvy, if you like. The time management's a little better. So that's what the evidence suggests. Now, those 2 25 mark essay style questions, you can get full marks. You can certainly get a good A star in 3 or 4 pages, including diagrams. But the crucial point, I really want to emphasize this, is that you must use the context in the essays. That's different to papers 1 and 2, where you just get a little stem. Okay. So Ethan says, when doing the 25 marker, do we have to refer specifically to the data? Ethan, the answer is yes. You must. It's not a standalone essay. It's an essay that you can use the context to help you answer, and you need to. So thank you for that question, Ethan. We really do appreciate it. Okay. Okay, so the key is, so just very quickly, the 10 and the 15 go. They've gone. So you get a 5, an 8, and a 12. Do the math, Ronnie. 5, 8, 12, 25 marks. You answer them in exactly the same way as you answer the data response 5, 8, and 12. And it's marked in the same way. But now you have 2 25 mark essay questions. Now, we say this is the synoptic paper. This is the only synoptic bit. Okay. And in the 25 mark questions, you get a choice for each of them. You write 1 micro KA paragraph and then evaluate it. Then you write 1 macro KA paragraph, then evaluate it. And then for the top marks, you need to write a brief final reasoned judgment. Okay. And for that final judgment, actually 3 or 4 lines is fine. We're not looking for chapter and verse. We're just looking for, I'll give you a couple of examples in a few minutes of some nice examples of final evaluative paragraphs. Okay. Tanisha says, for the 25 marker, Tanisha, we're going to have time for questions as well at the end. Can you add your own application as well as making reference to the data? Yes, you can. However, Tanisha, and this is a super important point, I'm sure you'll have the ability to do that. You must also use the evidence provided. So you can showcase your wider knowledge, but you must use it must use the context. Please, please, please. Okay. Adventurous Henry is to evaluate micro, macro. Yes. The expert says, what uni did you go to, Geoff? Well, I can't really say. I mean, yeah, I went to Cambridge. Now, okay, so here we go. So 25 mark questions, the only synoptic element. If you don't use the context, you will be capped at level 2 for KA. You just will be. Okay, if you write a purely theoretical answer that is not written in context. I'm sure nobody here is going to do this, but if you did that, you're capped to level 2. That will be for KA, and your cap really for evaluation will be certainly level 2. So you get a maximum score of around 12 or 13 out of 25. The average essay score, by the way, last year was 15.4 and 15.7. Now, read the question carefully. We're going to look at a couple of past papers, but it normally says assess, evaluate, micro and macro, hence the synoptic bit. But it could be micro and macro influences, causes, factors. It could be micro and macro effects, including costs and benefits. Or it could be micro and macro policies or strategies. So read the question carefully, and then you choose what to write about. Okay, so now just in terms of, I often get asked this question, okay, what do I write about in micro, what do I write about in macro? And I want to be reassuring actually in this session, because there's a bit of overlap, the truth be told. So for micro, anything, we use the mnemonic popsicle, sorry. Anything you're writing discussing market prices, output, profits, market structure, efficiency or inefficiency, anything to do with competition between businesses, anything to do with labour markets or market failures and externalities, anything along those lines is micro and is accepted as such. Okay, so popsicle for micro, and you only have to choose one of those. Okay, on the macro side, digestive for digestive, anything to do with development, inflation, economic growth and living standards, employment or jobs, the structure of the economy between different sectors, the trade position, inequality and the fiscal balance. Okay, keep in mind, everybody, loads of great questions coming through. We are going to leave time for questions, and our production team will be picking out as we go through. Here's one from Olive 1234. I've seen that you don't need a conclusion for 25 markers. Is this true? No, you do. Now, you may not have time to write a conclusion. That's fine. That happens. But you it's not the conclusion. It's a final comment, final reason comment. Yes, you're expected to write a conclusion. But critically, and again, the exam's live now, so I'm not going to make any comment, but you only need to write 2 KA points, one micro, one macro, and evaluate both points. You don't need 3. So that should give you time for a conclusion at the end. Okay. This structure worked well for paper 1. I hope it worked well for you in paper 2 as well. It works. Okay. On the left-hand side, these are the grade bound, so the grades, the levels the examiner works to. They all start at the midpoint. For example, if you think it's a level 3 paragraph, you start at 10 or 11. For evaluation, you start at 5 or 8 or 2. So there's your structure. It's a 5-paragraph answer. And on paper 3 on Thursday, you do that twice with supporting diagrams. Aaron will come on to your question about micro and macro in a second by looking at a couple of past papers. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple. We've chosen 2022, 2023. So this was paper 3, question 1. And you can see at ABC 5, 8, 12, all of those questions were micro actually in 2022, those first 3 questions. It's about the food delivery industry, Deliveroo et al. And then you had a choice of essays, either evaluate the micro and macro effects of a fall in the pound, refer to restaurants or other food delivery services in your answer, or evaluate the micro and macro effects of a significant increase in minimum wage. Good question. Refer to restaurants or other food delivery services in your answer. Okay, now I don't know which one you would have chosen. Actually, in the chat window, could you either put in the answer the letter D or E? Let's have a look, see what the collective wisdom, we've got nearly 400 people with us this afternoon. What would you have chosen? And let's have a quick look at the collective. If you're saying C, a lot of people would have gone for E. Yeah, I think so. We'd probably have gone for E. I like the question. I like D, by the way. That would have been a super question to write. I'm sure you could all think of one micro and macro effect of either fall in the pound or a rise in the minimum wage. But you have to refer to restaurants or other food delivery services. So you go back to the context when you can. Okay, so and the other one, question 2, again, 5, 8 and 12, the Lewis model. You have to revise everything on the spec. Quite a few people didn't know what the Lewis model was and the Lewis turning point. Demography effect in Kenya, absolute advantage, trade theory. So mainly macro there. And then evaluate the micro and macro effects of decreasing interest rates in Kenya or another developing country of your choice. Evaluate the micro and macro strategies that could be used to promote development in Kenya or another developing country of your choice. Again, which of those two questions would you have chosen? If you can throw your answer into the chat window, that would be great. Have a look in the chat window, see what people are deciding. And it looks as if the balance, I would say 60-40 D as opposed to E. And user one says they're both calm, I couldn't choose. Well, you have to choose. But again, I don't think you would have had a problem in 2022. Let's pass on to 2023 just quickly, conscious of time here. Now, crucially here, see what they did, the 5, 8, the 12. The 5 was about positive normative. The 8 marker was inflation. So they can put a macro question into the first question. But then it was about macro and micro policies to reduce inequality in the UK. Interesting. And macro effects of tax cuts. So you see question 1 there in 2023 had both macro and micro built into the ABC and also obviously the evaluative questions. And then let's look at context number 2. Explain one role of financial markets. Just before we started today, people saying should we revise financial markets? For sure, we have to. Examine 2 reasons why retailers remain small, micro, methods of price and non-price competition on the high street, micro. So you see we had 2 micro questions there. And people think question 2 is macro. Evaluate the micro and macro effects of falling house prices. Evaluate the micro and macro effects of labour shortages in the UK. Or a developed country of your choice. Now notice there question E, if you write about a developing country, you are in serious doodahs. Okay? Crucial point is on the left-hand side there. In all of your exams, all of them, you only ever need to analyse and evaluate 2 factors, 2 policies, 2 effects, 2 costs and benefits. Okay, we're not looking for 3. Okay, so let's have a quick look at a couple of contexts. We don't question spot in this live stream. I want to give you a couple of contexts and just tap into the collective wisdom of the group. My first context is migration. The UK has been a net importer of people for the last 30 years, as you can see. The blue line is above the black line. Blue line is people coming into the UK to study and work. Black line is people leaving. So the grey line is the net figure. Interestingly, the UK's foreign-born workforce increased by an average of 5% a year over the sort of 23-year period up to 2020 before the pandemic. The latest migration figures have just come out, and you can see that they've fallen quite sharply in terms of the net figure. So this is a really good, I mean, it could be part of a wider question about demographics and about unemployment and economic inactivity, all that kind of stuff. That could be the context. So over to you. Can you jot in the chat window maybe one micro, one macro effect of inward migration? What would you choose to write about? What do we think here? So the micro and macro effects of inward migration. What kind of things? We'll post a few of the answers onto the window. So what would you write about? Assess the likely micro and macro effects of inward migration. If you can, take a moment, put one micro, one macro in, and let's see what's coming through. Micro, dynamic efficiency for firms, as some have lower wage expectations. Yeah, possibly, that's more productive efficiency. Okay, so Kai, one of our great contributors, talks about AVCs falling as wages fall, as the labour supply increases. Yeah, okay, that'll be a good micro point. Thank you, Kai. Daisy talks about increased labour supply, downward pressure on wages. And the macro point would be a sort of AD effect as the population grows, yeah, particularly the employed labour force. Some great stuff coming through. I think we must find JT Galaxy if we can, who's become a legend over the last few months. He even appears in TikTok videos where people said, if JT couldn't answer this question, what hope is there for the rest of humanity? One micro effect is there'll be increased rent prices. Excellent point. The rental housing market would be micro, makes it harder for people to afford rent. So that'd be a really good micro point. And again, JT's point there, you don't have to develop and evaluate that point. You don't need the second micro point. Anna Bassi, again, one of our regulars, talks about a macro point. More people working, government receives more income tax revenue, more spending on infrastructure, healthcare, education. So you could take JT's point about rental accommodation as your micro, and Anna's point about macroeconomics. Lots of you talking about impact on labour supply, all good stuff. Yeah, let's see what I've come up with. So I've gone from the left-hand side. Yeah, I mean, again, you only need one of each, everybody, one of each. So you could build a really good micro point, as JT did, on the housing market, in particular rental, because the majority of migrants coming to work in a country tend to be short-term, and they tend to rent, not buy. You focus on the labour supply to a specific occupation, and the more specific you can be, the better. Health and social care, construction, farming, whatever it is. Okay, you could focus on business costs, revenues, and profits. Great cue there for diagrams. Again, try to be specific. Supermarkets, for example, or construction firms building rental properties. Or if you wanted to, you could talk about externalities, pressure on natural and built environment, water scarcity, pollution, congestion. You could talk about a market failure aspect. Anything is valid there. Oh, by the way, I'm going to make a really important point in a second about the balance between the two. On the right-hand side, growth, good opportunity there to shift AD and aggregate supply out. Airspace shift out as well. Consequences for living standards. I'll come on to Tom's point in a second. Fiscal effects, which Anna really focused on, and then the demography effects, impact on median age, hoping to overcome an aging population. So Tom's point was, can you evaluate a micro point with a macro evaluation? Yes, you can, but I'd be slightly cautious about doing that. You can, and you will be credited, Tom. If you can evaluate a micro point with a micro point, it's probably better if you want to just minimize the risk factor when it comes to marking, but you can, especially if it's a good macro point. So this is the whole point about synoptic economics. If we're going to ask you synoptic questions and say you can't write synoptically, that's a bit crazy, isn't it? But yes, you can, Tom. Okay, good stuff. So how to evaluate. Okay, well, just here's a couple of perspectives here. What do we think? How might you evaluate? Well, one is, yes, let's go through. So migration can fill skill shortages. Lots of people are saying that to increase labour productivity. It can stimulate entrepreneurship. Migration can also help to flatten the Phillips curve. Those of you who revised the Phillips curve for Thursday, it means you can bring down unemployment without causing inflation. But on the other hand, it depends on migrant skill levels. It depends on the median skills of migrants. It depends on how long they stay in a country. It also depends on the flexibility of the labour market and also regulations. So the impact depends on so many factors. Okay. Another point could be the impact on housing. Of course, in theory, it stimulates construction and related sectors, but it depends on the elasticity of new housing supply. Typically, new house building is price inelastic, and therefore prices and rents tend to go up. And of course, it depends on the regional concentration of migrant flows. So the net effects are greater when migrants tend to cluster, as they have in parts of the country. Maisie says, how does migration flatten the Phillips curve? Because it helps to bring down wage push inflationary pressure. And therefore, you can get a higher employment rate and hopefully a lower unemployment rate without causing inflation. Okay. Prav says, how do I write an evaluation about migration without sounding like Nigel Farage? Well, easy answer to that, Prav. You write like an economist. You keep the politics out of it as far as possible and write in a balanced, nuanced way. By the way, that phrase, my old tutor at Cambridge, Jim Trevithick, one of the great Keynesian economists, he passed away at the weekend at King's College, Cambridge, and he always used that phrase, write in a balanced way. One of the great Keynesians was Jim. So another evaluation point. So housing demand was a good one. I think let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, government finances. So Anna's point was that migrant flows can increase tax revenues. Younger working migrants tend to be net contributors. That's true, but that's just the evidence. Okay. But the effect depends on their age profile, their employment status, the wage levels. And of course, the UK government has moved to a skills-based, points-based migration system. The aim being to attract in migrants of graduate level jobs whose wages per capita are higher. Therefore, they will pay higher rates of income tax. But it just depends on the age profile, it depends on policy choices. In the short run, you've got increased government spending pressure for the NHS and social housing. In the long run, the fiscal dividend may work in the opposite direction. Okay. This is Edexcel A, by the way, to answer a question from Luke. Brilliant. Okay, let's have a look at one more. Oh yeah, sorry, final reason comment. Let's just spend a minute on this. What might you put in as your final reasoned comment on a question of migration? So we'll take a moment and let's see what comes through the chat window. So this is essentially the 9th mark for evaluation, but it can be the 8th and the 9th mark if you haven't quite smashed 2 previous evaluation points. So we're looking for 2 evaluation paragraphs, hopefully of level 3. But if you haven't quite done that, the final paragraph can really help lift your evaluation mark. So Emily says the effects of net migration depend on the reasons why they're migrating, education or employment opportunities. Excellent. Yeah, Shani says if the micro and macro effects are more important. So you might want to choose one. So well, I think the micro effects are more significant than the macro because. Yeah, so Josh Berman has a good approach there. Looking at Josh's point, which is more significant? What does it depend on? Long run versus short run? Josh, that's a really good approach to use, actually. Short run versus long run effects. Brenner talk about equity, efficiency, and effectiveness. Okay, well, and definitely. So consequences for fairness, inequality. Really good stuff. Yeah. Joe says it's likely to be more impactful on macro level due to the overwhelming impacts on AD and public sector strains. Possibly. Callum Williams talks about the demography, what demographic immigrants are, children and elderly, going to provide less benefits. We don't tend to get a lot of elderly immigrants, although because of now in particular the limiting family movements. Yep, some good points here. Excellent. My teacher said in judgment must have a new point. No, not necessarily, but say something. Take a step back. So Henry, you don't have to necessarily look at something completely new. Just take half a step back, which I'll show you an example in a second. So we can move on to my little example. On balance, I think it's a great way to start. The overall impact of inward migration depends heavily on factors such as skill levels of migrants, the flexibility of the labour market, and the capacity of public services such as healthcare. The micro effects are probably more important in the short run, whereas the macro impact, helping to address an aging population, is, in my view, the most significant long run point. So I've got this kind of short run, long run, micro, macro. Hopefully that makes sense. It doesn't have to be a long finishing section, and crucially, if you can, refer to some of the extracts. Put in a little bit of application right at the end. Okay, I thought you weren't supposed to say my view. You can say my view, providing you justify it. That's it. If that's your view, that's your view. Okay, but you want to avoid sounding like Nigel Farage. Oh, sorry, you want to avoid too much normative economics. But if you have a view, come to a view. Okay, in my opinion, my assessment is on balance. Okay, that's fine. It's all good. Let's try one more. Green subsidies. Again, thinking about environmental economics, financial economics. UK government is now offering a big range of subsidies, from boiler upgrade schemes, energy obligation companies. They have to, in theory, offer energy efficiency measures, including loft and wall insulation, feed-in tariffs. If you have solar panels, you can feed in surplus energy to the grid. The renewables obligation, which is where electricity suppliers have to source a certain percentage of energy from renewable sources. So a lot of intervention here at a micro level to try and drive net zero. But the total cost of subsidies is now estimated by the Renewable Energy Foundation to be over 223 billion over the last 20 years. Here's a question: evaluate the micro and macro effects of an increase in spending on green subsidies. What do we think? Over to you. 30 seconds or so on the clock. We've just got 2 or 3 minutes left on this one, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So what could be some of the micro and macro effects of green subsidies? What would you talk about? What do we think? Now, this could be, it's a UK focus, but of course it could be a development focus as well. They could look at green subsidies in the emerging country. So you just choose one micro, choose one macro, Some good answers coming through. Thank you, everybody. So PC, microdynamic efficiency, falling lower on average cost curves. Yeah, good. Excellent. Two really good points there. That's good synoptic thinking. Yeah, really good. Layla talks about greater national debt. UK's credibility falls, accumulate more debt. Okay, so a nice fiscal point. That will be a macro point. Oh, by the way, you don't have to do the macro point second. If you want to start with a macro point, you can. You don't have to go that way, but most people start with micro, then go macro. Emily talks about positive externalities. Yeah, that came up quite a bit on paper one, didn't it? With education and dental care. Social welfare, macro, closer to, increased government spending on subsidies. Multiplier effects, no doubt. Good stuff there from Tilly. Green subsidies cut costs for eco firms, lower prices. Encourages green investment and jobs, really good point. And Tilly smashes it by saying it reduces import dependency. Yeah, and Josh has a good micro, macro. Both of those actually, Josh, would be excellent because you could draw two really good analysis diagrams to help you along the way. Shall we try JT's point? Should we find JT? I mean, I think there's a momentum saying yes, please. Green subsidies will enable households to decrease reliance on gas and fossil fuels. Good. And it becomes cheaper to afford heat pumps, for example. Yes, in particular, especially if you get this combination of green subsidy and economies of scale. Keep in mind, of course, that heat pumps are expensive. Most families can't afford them. You're getting an idea. This is good stuff, everybody. Well done. Here are my points. So on the micro side, just choose revenues and profits for suppliers of energy, businesses that produce these heat pumps, or farmers that can afford to turn a field into a solar panel farm. Anything on market failure, anything on low-income households facing fuel poverty. So you could talk about particular households. And here's the point I wanted to make. Don't worry too much on Thursday if it's a bit blurry between micro and macro. As examiners, they are tolerant, okay? So they have to mark positively, and something with inequality or the labour market, that kind of stuff, it can be treated as micro or macro, as long as it's a well-made point. So don't worry too much and don't panic in the exam. The impact on low-income households, well, there could be millions of them. But if you just talk about individual households, that's micro. JT's mark should be halved to make it fair. Halved, take off 90% to make it equal playing field. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Geoff, expert tuition says to whatever you think is your strongest point, do first. I wouldn't have a strongest point. I'd have two great points, and I'd do them in the order in which I choose. On the macro side, growth. Yeah, I think quite a few were talking about the green jobs and the multiplier effect, of course. Quite a few were talking about competitiveness and trade. It's quite hard to export renewable energy, although Morocco is having a good go at it, but it does reduce import dependency. And the jobs and the fiscal effects. Now, here's a good point. That's really 2 points, but you can merge it into one. So green sectors pay taxes, they reduce benefit claims by creating jobs. So you could build in a pretty good macro point. Again, thinking about evaluation, Joe says, what do you do if there isn't any macro context in the extracts? There will be. So that answers that question. Okay, there will be. The contexts are written very, very carefully, extremely carefully. So for micro, the support for households to improve energy efficiency, but it depends on uptake. Heat pumps are expensive. Households may lack awareness. Subsidies may not be effective. But subsidies for EVs, really, they have a limited effect. There's a rebound effect. Households may use energy may use more energy once bills fall, interestingly. And crucially at the moment, because the likes of energy gas companies have to get certain energy from renewables, bills stay high even when world gas prices are falling, which can cause more fuel poverty. And then in terms of the final reason comment, the next slide. Evaluation, the big opportunity cost there of billions of subsidies. So you can always bring in opportunity cost in government failure. I think quite a few of you made the point about the national debt. So who's ultimately going to pay for these subsidies? And then moving on, final reason comment. Well, here's my example. So in the long run, green subsidies can drive sustainable growth and new jobs to help the UK transition to a low carbon economy. If renewables can achieve economies of scale, then prices will fall and the need for subsidy might decline. However, green subsidies need to be part of a mixed strategy. On their own, they're not enough. It's my reasoned comment, including carbon trading and tax incentives for R&D in clean energy technology, such as green hydrogen and next generation solar panels. Now, I haven't got a clue. I do not have a Scooby what next generation solar panels means, but I did have a former student who always used to write this in his answer. He ended up doing PP at Oxford. He used to put third generation clean energy or something, or next generation, thinking that the examiner would be thinking, well, that's interesting. Not just solar panels, but next generation solar panels. I don't know what it means, but it sounds kind of cool. Okay, there we go. So we have produced, I think, 16. We'll probably do a few more, like maybe today or tomorrow. Little synoptic shorts, 90 seconds. I think we've done 18, just looking at micro macro policies, micro macro causes, micro macro effects, and they're also available on TikTok. But of course, there's so much beautifully reasoned, coherent advice available from other sources. Right, let's open the floor. We do have 5 minutes before we have to head off. So Jim in the production room will put some questions on the screen and I'll do my best to answer them. Specifically, Geoff said, how do I know? Okay, so from Larry, do you have to use your own application in 25 marker, or can you just use the data given? You can just use the data given. And my strong advice, actually, Larry, is to focus on that. You can bring in your wider knowledge, particularly in the final comments, for example, but please do use the data as your base layer. Is spending on education and macro policy? Well, it came up on the micro paper. It's both. Pav says, Geoff's going to the gym in 5 minutes. No, I'm going in 8 minutes, actually. What do you recommend doing from now until Thursday? Well, just general revision, actually, because everything on paper 1 and paper 2 is testable on paper 3. Do have a look at those shorts, because and just think micro, macro. The 5, the 8, and the 12 is as before. Okay, so to answer Daisy's question, your 5, 8, 12 are just standard data response questions. Okay, whereas the 25 marker is the micro, macro. So do plan out some possible answers. Just do some essay planning for that, but just approach the data response questions in exactly the same way you did before. Okay. Would you recommend stating whether your point is macro or micro? Thank you, Shannon, for that question. Yes, I would actually. I would maybe start my paragraph with 1 micro effect could be, or 1 possible macro consequence could be. You don't have to, and a good examiner, and they do exist, by the way, should be more than capable of recognizing whether it's a micro or macro point. But Shannon, signposting what you're planning to do is a good thing to do. Makes it easier. Okay. Can we put less emphasis on revising topics that have already come up? No, because just because something came up on paper 1 and paper 2 does not mean it can't come up on paper 3. For some bizarre reason, people on the internet are saying, well, these are the topics that are likely to come up based on paper 1 and paper 2. Absolute nonsense. It betrays a complete lack of understanding of how exams are created, by the way. For 12 marker, thanks, Anna, is 1 point and 1 evaluation enough? Yes, Anna, the 12 marker is exactly the same as your data response for paper 1 and 2. A well-developed KA point and a well-developed evaluation point, perhaps with a diagram, is enough in 12 markers. You would normally do 2, and I'd expect to see 2 evaluation points. But you can do 1. Obviously, it's perfectly possible, but overall, I'd be going for 2. Other questions coming through? What's the difference between a micro macro policy, like an example to show? Well, I think, Maisie, micro macro policies, have a look at our shorts, actually. So we've done one on, for example, micro macro policies to reduce economic inactivity, or micro macro policies to encourage electric vehicles. So a micro policy typically affects individual households or businesses or industries, like a subsidy to farmers, whereas a macro policy is interest rates, corporation tax, which affects all parts of the economy. No conclusion for 12 marks, right? 2 right. Look, you do not need a conclusion for a 12 marker. Presumably some students have been taught to do this or told to do this. It's nonsense. You do not need any conclusion for a 12 marker. It's a complete waste of time. 8 markers, 1 or 2 KO paragraphs. Well, again, thanks to your question, Joe, it's same as paper 1 and paper 2. It's points-based marking. So you could get all 8 points in 1 paragraph if you wrote it in a certain way. Most students write 2 paragraphs, and they try and pick up the 8 marks by doing that, but you don't have to. Okay. Do you recommend choosing effects questions as a priority of the other types? No. I mean, choose the topic that you really think you can do a good job on. Policies, effects, causes. You should be able to cope with any of those. Just choose the topic that you think you're best suited for. Okay, but obviously read the questions carefully. Okay. What else do we think here? Can you explain Plebiscite? Well, I won't, Thomas. I won't explain it now because it's basically a macro topic, but it's basically the idea that developing countries need to industrialize to avoid becoming over dependent on primary sector industries. Okay. For a question where it tells you to draw a diagram, should you write 1K and evaluation point? Yes, that will be for a 12 marker, but obviously not for a 25 marker. And the other point to throw in here is that, do you need diagrams in the 25 markers? Yes. It'd be extremely unusual not to be using at least 1, possibly 2 diagrams, maybe 1 micro, 1 macro. Aim for 1 of each in your 25 markers, please. Aim for 1 micro diagram, 1 macro diagram. That has an insane effect on your mark. Okay. Should we prioritize a more in-depth analysis or having a conclusion? Well, Zane, both actually. So don't, you have to write 5 paragraphs in half an hour. There's a limit to how far your analysis can go, if truth be told, and I'd rather you did say something at the end in a manner that we've shown, rather than just leave it hanging out to dry. As Muta says, I always put in at least 1, often an easy ASAD diagram. Yeah, it's a go-to diagram. A Phillips curve is also a good approach, and maybe trade diagrams, that kind of stuff. Yeah, good stuff. Any other questions on paper 3? I think we've done quite a lot. We've done sort of micro and macro. I want to really get across today was what do we write for micro, what do you write for macro? There is some overlap. There's a bit of a blurring. Just shifting LRSAD give us the same amount of marks as shifting. No, the analysis diagrams are judged according to, are they developed? Are they relevant? Are they referred to in the text? Top says, can the trade diagram be used for micro and macro? Yes, if you're drawing a tariff diagram, for example, affecting what industry in particular, then that would be a perfectly valid micro diagram. Okay. Oh, a really good question here from Harry. Harry Eastick. Can I talk about unemployment as a macro point whilst also talking about labour markets for micro? Yes, you can. Harry, what I would say there is that if you're using labour markets at a micro level, try to make it specific to an occupation or an industry. That makes it more micro. Does that make sense, Harry? But of course, for unemployment, focus on the bigger picture. A country unemployment, for example. Ralph says, Geoff, I'm going to miss you. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. No more live streams for Edexcel. We've got one for AQA tomorrow. Okay. Excellent stuff. All good. Well done, everybody. So keep in mind, we do a few more shorts. We'll get some more shorts on the TikTok, GTG TikTok channel tomorrow. Also available on YouTube as well. What those are, the 90-second, 6 slides, 3 micro points, 3 macro points. So we try and choose topics that are interesting and topical and useful for paper 3. Okay. Tomorrow is AQA. It's quite specific, AQA, in particular the 25 mark recommendation question and the 10 mark data question. Hey, we've come to the end of our Edexcel series. I think we've done nearly 40 live streams over the last 4 or 6 months. And we've created a kind of community of students who've been super supportive of each other and really, really positive. It's great to meet a lot of you on our Grade Booster courses. So from me, every best wish for Thursday. I will do my best to answer questions posted on the YouTube channel. So please do ask questions if you need any bit more support. But most of all, give it your best shot on Thursday morning. It's all we can ask. You can only ever do your best, and your best is good enough. It really will be. Let's finish the economics exam in really good spirit and good shape, and head into the summer with a smile on our faces. Take care and see you soon.